Hello, you're watching Kitco News, and I'm Michelle Makori. Inflation has arrived even by the Fed standards. One of the Fed's most closely watched inflation measures has hit its highest level in 13 years. The Personal Consumption Expenditure Index rose 3.1% in April from a year ago, and that is excluding food and gas. Meanwhile, expect more fiscal stimulus with President Biden laying out his $6 trillion budget proposal for 2022 this Friday. Let's discuss with Dr. Ron Paul, former congressman from Texas and current host of the Liberty Report. Dr. Paul, great to have you back with us on Kitco.
Michelle, nice to be with you.
All right, Dr. Paul, we spoke a few months ago and you warned us that with all this money printing from the Fed and the stimulus checks handed out by the Biden administration, that inflation was inevitable, inflation which you described as a tax on everyone. So now that even the preferred Fed measures point to inflation, what does that signal to you?
Well, it looks like there's a lot more of the same, but you know, the one thing that I like to do is when I think about inflation, talk about inflation, my definition is slightly different than the conventional use of the word. And most people say inflation, and you refer to prices going up, CPI and other prices, but the prices going up is a secondary event. It is a response to the inflation. It's a symptom of the inflation. The inflation is the Fed and what they do. I think the two most dramatic charts, they're very similar. If you go and look at, I go to St. Louis Fed and look for a chart on the monetary base or M1, you see a flat line going on for decades, flat. And then the last couple of years, you see something going straight up. And that's the supply of money. In the 70s, when we were watching inflation and the breakdown of the Bretton Woods and all that was going on there, every day there was talk about what's M1 doing, what's M2 doing, and M3. And now they don't even record some of those numbers. They emphasize that the money supply, what are they going to do with the money supply? And that isn't even brought up again because nobody wants to talk about it, because the money supply is increased for the benefit of those individuals who depend on new money and easy money and zero interest rates. And that's, guess what? That's a bunch of Republicans and Democrats in Congress that keep spending. But if we had real interest rate, all the spending would stop. So to me, it's the excessive spending, which is a tax, and then it gets monetized, and then prices eventually go up. Now, the reason that people say, well, that's been going up for 2 years. Why did it just happen this week? That's the way it works, because there's a subjective factor in when prices go up. And it's called the subjective theory of value. And so you can't predict that. That is a response to human action, the activity of millions, if not billions of people buying and selling. And then when they decide, it surprises even me, even though I accept this, that, a year ago, people weren't worried enough. And then within the last month, a lot more people have become worried. But that's all a reflection of us not getting the real information from the government. I don't believe all the statistics. As a matter of fact, I'm suspect on what the government tells us most of the time. But when they tell you that the CPI is doing something, just think, I think the silliest thing I've ever heard of in monetary policy for years now, it may be 3, 4, 5 years, that the principal policy of the Fed was we have to get inflation, which was the cost of living and the prices of goods and services go up at least 2%, because inflation, prices going up, is a sign of an economic growth. That's literally crazy stuff. And that is what they were doing, and they got it. Now they got the inflation. According to them, the prices are going up, but believe me, it's going to be much more than they were. And they're going to be talking real soon about how do we stop these price increases? And then you better look out for what kind of mischief they'll get involved in when they start doing that.
Well, do you think that the Fed can stop price increases with policy? Because the Fed has been saying that inflation will be transitory, but once prices of goods go up and you're paying more for clothes, cars, and food, can the Fed actually reverse that?
No, they have no control whatsoever. And this is the end point. They have a lot of control on interest rates and spending money and providing credit, bailing on people, and that sort of thing. But once the people wake up and realize that there's too many Federal Reserve notes circulating there, and that they just can't change it. They will try it, and they've done it ever since Roman times. What they do is they come in and wage and price control. Wage and price controls were known in ancient history because they did the same thing. They debased the currency, which meant the prices went up. And no, they'll have some form of wage and price controls. They already do have some prices are controlled. I mean, in one way, they manipulate wages, through union activity as well as minimum wage laws. They're manipulating prices. The most important thing under these conditions, if you wanted to move away from it, let everything go. And during the Depression, they did not want the market to handle things in the Depression because the market always wants to deflate. They want to get rid of the bad debt. They want to get rid of the bad investment, the malinvestment. And politicians and investors, they don't want that. And that's what prolongs the agony. And actually, and I do remember the Depression times and the war, the bad times were from the crash of 29 up to about 1946, because the war, believe me, things were depressed in the war. They actually got worse during the war, but then it just takes a long time. But if you allow it to correct like they did in 1921, they can liquidate the bad investments and the debt, and you can get back to new growth. But you don't have any effort to create new growth right now. They create the money, but where does it go? It gets people to stay at home. We pay the people to stay at home instead of them working and increasing real growth. They pay through inflation, printing money, and people get to stay home. And some of them, I guess, sort of like it because they're not worrying too much about getting a job, and the jobs are available.
Well, Dr. Paul, one of your criticisms regarding the Fed is that we're seeing the Federal Reserve take on a more political role. President Biden has ordered the Financial Stability Oversight Council to prepare a report on how the financial system can mitigate the risks related to climate change. Now, the council is composed of the heads of the major federal financial regulatory agencies, including the Federal Reserve. So essentially, the Fed would now be able to mitigate the risks related to climate change by using its regulatory authority. So, for example, by encouraging banks to lend to green businesses and by denying capital to polluters, if you will. And the Fed could also use quantitative easing to give green industries potentially an advantage over competitors deemed as non-green. Now, you recently wrote a piece about the woke Fed, as you put it, addressing that issue. So break that down for us.
Well, the whole thing is the Fed is making a significant change in their attitude and their positions. Used to be they were worrying about prices going up and unemployment. Then they decided, well, we have a responsibility about long-term interest rates, and how do you have QE if we don't do that? So they have these jobs that they do, and they do a lot of regulation. But now they have moved into the area of wokeism, and they have tremendous power to intimidate business people. Big question, and I'm trying to work this on a paper that I'm doing now, is why do business people capitulate and get involved in some of this mischief that's gone on, the lockdowns and things, and following, because the lockdown is fake, but the business meeting goes along with it. It's because the Fed is powerful and intimidate, and they can regulate the money that they get. They can regulate who gets punished during, a lockdown, and who gets the recovery when they start bailing out. And they're doing it for a lot of different things. Anytime there's a need for a social measure, they don't have a law that says, you can't do that. If you do that, we're going to put you in jail. No, what they do is they have the businessman come in to support the Fed and says to your people, you will wear your mask, because if you don't, we're going to fire you. So the Fed steps back and say, oh, no, we don't do that. And the Congress, they don't write the laws that said that you're going to lose your job if you don't do this. But the businessman does, because he is intimidated And all the way back, the most recent time in history otherwise was the businessman and how it supported, the dictatorship of Hitler and others. But they're very much involved now. The corporate world, Wall Street, very much dependent on the Fed, and the Fed can punish a corporation, so they go along. But you have to see them all in one piece. But then there's those who are honest business people. There are honest workers and people who don't endorse all this stuff. But believe me, can you imagine being able to write laws on the lockdown and keep people from going to church? And now it's turning out that, most of that pandemic was fictitious. People got sick, and we know all that, but it was nothing like that they claimed it to be, to literally cause these kids. The kids have not been, they had to wear masks, and nobody's ever gotten the disease, essentially. They don't get the disease, and yet they're still wearing masks in a lot of places. It's intimidation because there's too much power, and that's why I've argued against the Fed. I started arguing against the Fed in a serious manner 50 years ago, because that is when 1971, the Bretton Woods broke down, and there was no restraints on what the Federal Reserve would do, and there would be no restraints on spending. That's where we are today, at a critical point where this can't last a long, long time, like 50 years. This can last a while. Right. We don't know when it'll end, but it will end because it's non-viable.
Well, look, there has been a lot of debate and a lot of controversy regarding the response to the COVID-19 virus and whether measures were taken were too extreme. But to your point, we do have bodies that are supposed to be apolitical by definition and by essence, in fact, enhancing or exerting their political influence by the way that they allocate resources and funds. And that's why you and others are now creating more of a call for a Fed audit. What would that mean exactly, Dr. Paul?
Well, we don't know what they do on bailouts, who gets the money, trillions and trillions of dollars are spent and passed out. And, the money, according to the Constitution, everything has to be authorized and appropriated by the U.S. Congress. Well, none of that. How much have they spent in this last year or two? Like $6 trillion? And nobody actually knows how that happens. And it's being passed out for social reasons. It might be global warming, and it might be for some other event, but it's one of these events that has very little to do with the economic needs of the country. But the effort to do this will continue. This very, very powerful. I want an audit. I started doing that. Matter of fact, even in the first time I went to Congress, I had been there a couple of times. In the 70s, that was one of the first things I did, was ask for an audit of the Federal Reserve. And it's picked up steams. We've had 2 votes into Congress, in the House at least, and passed overwhelmingly to find out what's going on, transparency. And there were a lot of liberal Democrats voted for him back then. Back in the 70s and the 80s, the vitriol, the fighting and the screaming and the accusations weren't anything like they are today. So you could work out, and there were a lot of people that said, you're right. And a lot of members of Congress would come and they said, I never did really understand this Federal Reserve and how they do these kind of things. But they thought that the audit was a good approach. I want to get rid of the Fed. The Fed's a horrible, horrible way to run an economy. But they wanted to they wanted to do that. They can do this, and that is the reason why I think that audit is very necessary. Because if you had a true audit and knew who was receiving all the gravy, maybe they'd want to get rid of the Fed. But the thing's going to collapse on us. This can't be viable. We'll have to have serious monetary reform. We will not pull out of this like we do in 79 and 80 with Volcker saying, well, we've had it, we've overdone it, 21% interest rates, we can't stand it. We're going to bite it, and we have to do it. That's not going to happen this time.
When you say collapse, what does that mean exactly?
Well, take a look maybe at the lower 20% of the people's income right now. Take a look at the streets in New York, Detroit, and Chicago. And take a look at a great city like San Francisco. They're out in the streets, and there's people say, well, there's not enough money. Well, there's too much money in the wrong hands. So no, it's already started. And if you look at the debt, the obligation of the federal government and individuals, even though cash balances have gone up, but it's not real money. It's just cash. It's just numbers. It's digits. So
right.
people have been able to pay down their debt and do a few of these things. But no, there's a certain amount of people in big trouble. I think the economy will really, really slow up because I think the numbers are fiction. You know, if prices go up 10%, that goes in, oh, GDP is going up. Prices are going up, so GDP must be going up. And I think that this administration is not doing any favors on energy. I think you're going to see oil prices continue to go up, and it's going to affect everybody. But that isn't the inflation. That's the consequence of the inflation of running up these debts. You know, right now we collected about $3 trillion in taxes this year, and we're spending $6 trillion. Well, we're just common sense. I bet you if I got a bunch of 12-year-olds in grade school, I could explain this to them. They say, why do people how do they do this? It won't work. So, but they keep thinking it will. They think it's magic, but it'll come to a head no matter how much power the members of Congress have and the power of the president and the power of the Federal Reserve. It doesn't work because it's defying all economic laws.
Well, you know, Dr. Paul, because of this discontentment with the unchecked power of central banks, of the Fed, of the government, the way that money is being printed, the potential debasement of the dollar, which does seem to be an inevitability at this point, according to many, we're seeing a rising interest in alternatives like Bitcoin as a potential crypto asset, as a potential alternative store of value. Now, you're speaking at the Bitcoin 2021 conference in Miami later this week. You've always been a staunch supporter of free markets, libertarianism, and a proponent of safe haven assets like gold. So where does Bitcoin fall into this for you? What are your views on Bitcoin?
Well, I know a lot more, at least I'll make the claim, a lot more about precious metals being money. And I was fascinated with this for a long, long time. But I'm also fascinated with what's coming. And people ought to have as much freedom as possible to have choices. So the one bill that I thought was a very important bill that I introduced in Congress, not only to audit the Fed, but also to get rid of the legal tender laws, competition, because right now there will be a debate, and I'm sure there'll be a debate at the end of this week. You know, some people, matter of fact, most people I meet in conferences like this they don't hate gold or anything. They just might like crypto a little bit more. But the debate will continue, and the market will finally determine that. My goal is to legalize the competition, and that I think the people will sort it out. Freedom of choice will sort it out, and I don't think the bureaucrats or the politicians in Washington are capable of doing this. And that's one of the things that people are attracted to in the cryptocurrencies. It sort of has this going with the absence of government and central banking. My concern is that governments over the centuries have been notoriously very eager to have control of the money. Believe me, they will not give up control of the money. They will not. I don't think you're going to have a Federal Reserve Board chairman come up soon and say, Ron Paul has this good idea. Let's get rid of legal tender laws.
Well, when you say, Dr. Paul, legalize the competition, what does that mean with regards to Bitcoin? And what role do you see Bitcoin potentially playing in that kind of monetary system?
Well, it would mean that, if right now, if you buy and sell gold, you get it taxed. They can do that. If you make a profit in Bitcoin, you read stories about people being taxed on it. You can't tax money. You don't tax it. If you bought $1 a year ago and it went down 10%, you can't take a loss because your dollar lost value. So it's the currency that if you compete with it, in some ways there's a little bit of that internationally, but nobody's allowed to compete at a national level. We're not allowed to compete with the currency. I know during the presidential campaign, a few of my enthusiastic supporters actually designed a coin, and they had my image on there, which was pretty silly, and they called it a Ron Paul dollar. They got into big trouble. They got in trouble because they could not use the word dollar. That was encroaching on the monopoly control of money.
But what is the main theme that you plan on conveying about Bitcoin when you address the conference on Friday? What is your overall perspective on Bitcoin?
Well, I won't try to explain exactly technically where it's good, bad, or indifferent. I will argue more the case for the legalization of freedom of choice. And the people should make the decision, not the government. And I don't know the answers of that because some people are enthusiastic about it and think that that's the only money that will exist and will replace the dollar. I think the dollar is going to be around, but it's not going to be worth much. And but payment of bills and the legal tender laws force you to use legal tender, so they won't even allow you to replace the dollars with a cryptocurrency. There will be laws against that. And but I wanted to totally legalize it. I think our problem isn't the technicalities of the gold standard or crypto. Our problems are the dependency on government and less concern about personal liberty. And what about property rights and contract rights? This is what we need to be concentrating on. And right now, though, people are interested in, what the laws are regarding crypto and gold and all these things. But right now, our biggest threat in this last year, people haven't awakened to the point of what a horrible year where the Federal Reserve and the monetary authorities put on these sanctions and literally lock us up in our houses and make us wear masks that nobody's proven a mask does any good for you. It does when you might be doing surgery in a hospital, and I wore a mask then, but no, the mask is no proof of it. The lack of competition, say in medicine, when they had a good medication like hydroxychloroquine or ivermectin, they take it off the market. They made it illegal to use it. And that's what I want to make sure people can use the gold and silver and save their money in it and not ever have to pay any taxes on the increase in the value of your substitute for money, which means you'd have to dramatically reduce the size and scope of government. And that's where the hang up is. No, there's nobody in Washington. No, there's a few people, a handful or two. But no, the Republicans and Democrats have the same goals, spend a lot of money. When Republicans have been in charge, the deficits go up just as much and sometimes more, and that's what they depend on. You don't have the Republicans and the Democrats, arguing over the Federal Reserve or the budget. They don't argue over the foreign policy. Oh yeah, they debate the foreign policy, but nobody wants to cut a nickel out of that monstrous bubble in the military spending, and we spend more than 70% of the other nations put together, and we always have to be more. We got to be prepared. There's another war coming, and that's how they beat the drums of war. While I was there in the early part of this century, 10 years. And no, we've been in Afghanistan for 20 years. But that's good for the military-industrial complex. That's what has to be challenged. So the money issue, for me, in some ways, is a side issue because if you really had what I'm talking about, the contract would decide which money you're going to draw your contract up in. And if you wanted to draw up your contract in gold ounces, you could, or if you wanted to draw up their contract in crypto. Right. That you could do that. Right now, not too many people are doing that.
But do you think, though, Dr. Paul, to your point, because the government and central banks have so much to lose, so much power to relinquish, that as you mentioned earlier, they will somehow intervene, crack down, regulate increase taxes stand in the way of the real rise and potential of Bitcoin?
Yes, but I would apply that same concern to gold.
Right.
Because, what was the first thing Roosevelt did in 1933? He immediately took all the gold from the people. It was $20 an ounce, and he pushed it up to $35 an ounce. And they do that, made it illegal. And the American people tolerated it all the way from 34 up to 1975, over 40 years. Americans weren't allowed to own gold. In the early 80s, I worked real hard and prodded them along to legalize gold and silver. And at least you can buy silver eagle and gold eagles, but you need to legalize freedom. And that I think is the hardest thing for people to accept, because they want to be taken care of. And that's why, right now people are very content that are receiving nice checks every month. They're so content they don't want to go work, and there's jobs going back. It's one of the weirdest things. This predicting exactly what's going on right now would have been a hard prediction, but it's understandable from an Austrian viewpoint. Things like this can happen, but it doesn't make sense. But what does make sense, it can't last. You can't create wealth out of thin air. The duplication of monetary units has nothing to do with wealth. It undermines and destroys and dilutes wealth.